And as we're connecting with our legislators and connecting with fellow volunteers and our community, so much of what is foundational is being able to tell our story, why we care about an issue, how it's affected us, what we've been doing to work on this issue. That's how you can get legislators to really listen to you. That's how you can connect to your friends and neighbors and business owners. And so learning how to tell a powerful story is really going to go a long way in our civic engagement practice. So quick reminder of our mission at Surfrider, our dedication to the protection and enjoyment of the world's ocean, waves, and beaches for all people through our activist network of all of you. Oh, we got more people joining in. And sorry, oops. And a reminder of our diversity, equity, and inclusion statement. Surfrider Foundation is dedicated to being an organization for all people. So that is a really important part of everything that we're doing. And storytelling is also a great way to be able to connect people of all ages, all walks of life, all backgrounds. And as part of this series, and I think all of our trainings, will be continuing to do land acknowledgements. It's so important for all of us coming from different spots around Oregon to think about the land we're on, the beaches that we go to, and thinking about the history and the current state here in Oregon. So I'll just let everyone take a minute to read this to themselves. Okay. Great. I think, yeah, reflecting on the past history of this land and who's been here before us and the people who are all sharing this land now and moving forward is also a really important part of our story. So something that we should all be carrying with us and thinking about. And so we all have stories to tell, but how can we make people actually want to listen and take the time to listen to us? So we've brought in a special guest today to give us some insight and inspiration, and Bree can introduce him a little bit more too. So I'll hand it over to you, Bree.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. We're really grateful to have Paul joining us. He's a freelance writer and editor specializing in the outdoors, environment, and science. And he's also English and writing faculty at the Oregon Coast Community College. And so, Paul, you can add whatever else you'd like. I just wanted to do a quick introduction and take it away, Paul.
No, it's great. I appreciate it.
Anna, I think you'll have to stop your screen share so that he can share.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm definitely stoked on this. I'm just going to walk us through some slides as well. And I think the idea will be to just give you some tools, some like inspiration, as Anna mentioned, some ideas around what's worked for me in the past for both like brainstorming and then getting out and publishing and getting the word out on various things. And then we'll have some Q&A after and just kind of chat and see how that goes. So thanks again. So let me share the screen here. All right, and so the focus is on the written word. So we'll keep talking about writing and its power. But first, I just wanted to start with an image. Does anybody know this woman, Lois Gibbs? Does this name ring a bell? Lois Gibbs moved to Niagara Falls area in 1978 in what was called the Love Canal neighborhood. And shortly after moving there, her husband was a chemical worker. There's a lot of chemical plant there. Her son started having these weird illnesses. And she had never been environmentally active or any sort of political active prior to that. But she basically started going around the neighborhood and asking neighbors if they were experiencing anything like that. And long short of it was they realized their neighborhood was built on a toxic dump site. So they began to write. She began to write. She wrote petitions. She wrote letters to editors. She wrote her politicians, legislators, and and soon enough, they had a community of activism together. And in time, her work and their work together in their community led to what was the Superfund, EPA Superfund toxic dump cleanup. So I just think it's a cool way of thinking a little bit about grassroots, early environmental justice, environmental activism on a real grassroots scale. And her quote, "Average people in average community can change the world," I think is worth holding on to. Just something to ponder as we move forward. And inherent to her was her story and writing her story down. So I'm going to start by talking about writing your congressperson and just some tools there. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about writing letters to editors, and then also a little bit about blogging. And throughout all three of those topics, there'll be this theme of storytelling and kind of just thinking in this linear way that I'll talk about as I go. So let's imagine we're writing our elected official, and I adapted this from the ACLU. And there's a few rules here, and I think it's worth thinking about those rules and paying attention to them. Anybody can write their elected official, but I think what ACLU suggests and what I'd agree with is keeping it brief and keeping it focused on the issue at hand, whatever that may be. Usually you want to keep it no longer than a single spaced page. And that just shows respect for the format and the official or the staffer who's reading it before the official might read it. Introduce yourself, tell them who you are, what you want. If you can, it's good to know what specific piece of legislation you're attending to, be it HR bill this or Senate bill that. It just shows that you're, focused on that one thing. You're focused on that one topic, and that's what you want to address. It's recommended, and I agree. For whatever reason, in writing, we talk a lot about three as a number, lists of three, as something I think both for getting us to think a little bit deeper about a topic, like beyond just one or two, but for three examples, within the sub theme of your big point, right? So the three strongest points that you can make in being effective in persuading your legislators to support your position, and try to flesh these ideas out. And basically, I think that can help you kind of format the outline of your letter. Personalize it, right? So if we go back to Lois Gibbs, and what's kind of cool is we'll look at a letter she wrote in 2016, so almost 40 years after her initial work. She's still active in this. And you'll see even then that she personalizes her thinking and personalizes her letter. But here it is, and here's the gist of it. What is your story, and how does that connect to you or your family, right? The issue at hand, be it beach cleanups, ocean acidification, warming temperatures, wildfires in the Coast Range, whatever these things are that you're concerned about, dump sites. How is that connected to you? Where did you first learn about this? How did it affect you? Was it sensual? Was it smoke entering your, when we had the wildfires, there was, ash on our windowsill and we had to vacuum it up. That kind of detail, those kind of poignant, sensual details can go a long way in an era of, so we sort of live in an era of tweeting and Snapchat and real quick information. But I think the beauty of the written word in 2021 is that it slows us down. It connects us to one another on a deep level, and it can really make our point effective. So if you have a story, or if you can think a little bit about whatever it is that got you involved in this political issue, I think that's where you want to start. Okay. Let me pause. I've kind of fire hosed you with a bit of information. Is there any questions or comments at this point as we talk a little bit about these letters to Congresspeople?
And if you have questions, feel free to either use the chat or unmute yourselves to ask.
Cool. Another thing to think about is if you have sort of a closer relationship to your congressperson, Beyond, okay, so have you voted for this person? I think that says a lot. Have you contributed money to the campaign? Did you know them when they were younger? Did you have any business or personal relationships to these people at any point? I think that that's an effective tool as well for personalizing and getting closer to whatever the situation at hand is. Um, Remind them who you are and the connection to you. The closer the legislator feels to you, the more powerful your argument is likely to be.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Um, just because I don't know, what actually happens to these letters when you send them? So I'm assuming that when I email Jeff Merkley or Senator Schrader or whatever, that they're not actually reading it, that the staffer's reading it. And then what happens to it from there? Like, does it just get put in a, I mean, how do you know that that it actually is, that information is getting to the person?
Yeah. I mean, I've heard both that people have gotten responses directly, and that it also seems to get lost in a cloud. Maybe Bree would know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so it kind of depends, to be honest. In some cases, I know the staffer might have a spreadsheet that has bill numbers and emails for and emails against the bill number. So it kind of depends. I think that the more compelling your comments are, kind of following exactly what Paul is saying, the more likely it might be to get forwarded to the elected official. But that's one of those really tough things because it's so different in each office, but the staffers definitely are reading them. And in some cases, they're sending you back a canned response that might have your elected official's name. And in some cases, it does actually get through to them. So it's kind of hard to know if you're working with them to like address an issue. For example, a lot of people worked with their elected officials to help with unemployment at the start of COVID. That's definitely staffers working with you, corresponding using the representative's email, for example. So depends a little bit based on the elected official.
Great, thanks. All the more reason to write a powerful letter. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe all the more reason to follow that one-page format and just kind of play by those rules a little bit, just so that it doesn't get tossed. I just feel like so much gets like tossed out because of lack of format or lack of just concern for that outline. So I don't know. We're thinking about anyways. But yeah, definitely. Let's keep going. Let's see, resume share. Sorry. And remember, at the end of the day, like you're the expert on the topic. You live in the community. It's in like Lois Gibbs's case on that dump site, like it's literally her children. And the congressperson is not on that block necessarily. So that congressperson might not even know about the issue that's at hand. And you're, in some cases, presenting information that is impacting you and your community directly. So remember, like these people are elected to represent you. I think it's good to be courteous. It's good to be respectful, but you also don't need to be afraid to take a firm stance on the position at hand. And that's a hard balance to strike, especially when you're worked up about something. It's completely understandable. Yet again, the written word is a good space because it slows us all down, both as writers and as readers, and we can kind of work out our own ideas, share those ideas, and expose other people to them as well. Okay, cool. I want to move on to letters to the editor. There's some of the same rules in play, but it is a different kind of beast. Is there any questions on this initial piece before we move on? Okay, LTEs, letters to the editor. So what we're talking about are newspapers generally, and these are effective modes of communication because they reach a large audience. I mean, there is still a readership of newspapers. As we'll see later, one of our Waldport residents, the director of library down there, I actually wrote an LTE to the New York Times earlier in February and was published. And so imagine that, like, here we are, a small community, you have an issue, and next thing you know, you're in the biggest publication in the country, right? Well, one of anyways. So LTEs are super effective. They can reach a large audience, and then of course you can ping them onto social media and reach an even larger audience. Um, a letter to the editor, just technically, is responding to an article in a newspaper. Something comes out, and then you say, "Hey, this affected me this way," and so that's what that is, or what this is. This is what I'm talking about. It's also worth noting that your elected officials are monitoring this stuff, especially if it pertains to them in their district. So keep that in mind. It's another way of kind of, if you imagine writing the congressperson and an LTE, and you have both coming at it from both sides, you now have two modes of communication. With social media, a third mode of, fourth, fifth mode of communication. It all of a sudden becomes part of their psyche, and they have to wake up to this situation. This is also a way of bringing info that's not mentioned in the news. And again, that's that grassroots, like on the ground community voice, real voice that we get in personalized writing in response to some situation in your community. It also creates an impression of widespread support for an issue or opposition to an issue, which is also going to be effective politically. Keep it brief. Often there's a word count. Often it's pretty short, 250 or so. Well, it can be a little bit longer depending on the newspaper, but that's okay. Like if a tweet it's like 40 characters, 250 words is a lot, and it's all relative, right? So check out the word count. Again, just like the one-page letter to the congressperson, adhere to it as best you can. Don't be afraid to send it out to smaller news sources. There's the big Oregonian, but then there's the News Times that I write for, and the smaller ones are frankly relatively easier to publish in. They're looking for content, they're looking for interesting information, and the Oregonian has a lot of flow coming in, whereas News Times or your local paper might be a little bit easier to get into. And then I have some templates here, and this looks like this is being recorded. So I'm also happy to share these slides, of course, afterwards. But it's just some like basic templates. Some of them are kind of playful and silly, but the idea is that you just respond to whatever the other writer was saying. So I was disappointed to see the News Times editorial on May 18th. Don't tell me I can't explode fireworks on Nye Beach. The writer omitted some key facts in the debate, or I strongly disagree with so-and-so, or I'm deeply saddened that Congressman Doe is working to roll back, whatever. And you just kind of fill in the blank. And again, if you can relate your story, relate your reasoning behind why this issue is important to you, we'll get some more traction. Let's see. Let me do this slide on the Waldport Library and show you her response, and then I'll take some questions. So again, with the congressperson, find your story when writing your LTE. And so on February 25th, Newport News Times reported this Waldport Public Library piece. And here we have Sue Bennett, who actually published an LTE in the New York Times. And so the Times published this visual kind of comic strip about little free libraries. It seemed innocuous enough. It seemed pretty mellow. And then Sue Bennett it caught her eye down in Waldport, and she wrote the Times, and she said many public libraries did close. However, it was only the buildings that closed. Library staff around the world have worked hard to find new ways to provide library materials for their patrons, schools, and communities while implementing new health mandates to keep everyone safe. So she's just given a shout out to all the librarians out there trying to make it work. And the New York Times thought that was cool, published it, and there you go. Questions on LTEs, or for those who joined a little bit late on, we talked about writing your congressperson. Any questions so far?
So an LTE is a response to a specific article, or
Correct.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the flip side of that, and I could walk us through it at another time, or talk to Bree about adding a slide and sending out, would be an op-ed, which would be the initial article from the public, and that would just be you calling attention to anything. Hey, I wanted to write an opinion piece about I don't know, helicopter chemical application of herbicides, and you would publish that in the News Times, and then somebody else might come out and write an LTE against that, um, or in response to that. And so that's kind of the way LTEs are, just kind of this conversational piece, often started maybe by an op-ed um, in a paper. But it's the same rules kind of apply with the op-ed. There's a word count. It's story based. It's an argument that you're making about something to draw attention to something.
And Paul, from outside of the journalism world, I would say those terms get used loosely, letter to the editor versus an op-ed. And especially when we're looking at smaller publications, for the sort of bigger publications like the Oregonian, the Register Guard, the Statesman, it's more clear cut. And like when you're working on an op-ed, you're actually working with the editor and there's some back and forth versus the letter to the editor that you just send in and they print.
Yeah.
So sort of in the field, we don't always use those terms correctly in the actual journalism sense of letters to the editors versus op-eds.
That makes sense. Yeah, for sure. But I think the same rule about like just finding your story and kind of articulating how it affects you and your community is always the ground rule for getting going, despite the format. So yeah, good point. Other questions, thoughts before we move on to the last piece, which is blogging.
Maybe you talked about this already, but is there some sort of protocol for politeness here? I mean, somebody can be really angry in their response and probably no one's going to listen if it's like that, or it's going to polarize the audience. Is there some sort of guideline for that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it a few slides ago. I just said being courteous when writing your elected official. I mean, that's not easy, especially if you're choking on wildfire smoke or you're watching the oceans wash up a bunch of plastic. Like you're worked up, understandably, and I think that's one of the, I guess, positives of writing and not tweeting or not just like sending out something on social media is you actually have to stop and hopefully revise and hopefully read it to somebody in your household or discuss it with somebody else, and you can kind of work through some of that and look for places to tone it down. But striking the balance of heat and frustration and injustice with being civil is not an easy art. I think it just takes trying and failing, and I think revising and sharing is really important. If you can share it with people, it just gets out of your own echo chamber and into the world at large, if that makes sense.
I have a question sort of building off of that. In your revision and sharing process, do you usually read what you wrote out loud while you're doing that, or just silently and send it to people to kind of read to themselves in their heads?
I like to read out loud sometimes. Depends on the piece, but yeah, it just sort of depends on the piece. But I think reading out loud is crucial because you're going to hear it in a way that you wouldn't hear it otherwise, for sure. Okay. Let's move on to blogging, the last piece of written word, and probably one of the most fun in my opinion, because this is where you can kind of stretch your legs, and the word count is going to be a little less. I like to, well, because I like to do this writing and I want to get my name out there somewhat, I like to reach out to people and ask if I can guest blog. So I'll do that with I've done that with some scientists at Hatfield who run a blog for their lab, and it's usually pretty sciencey. And I'll ask if I can like do more of an artistic piece, and you know, you'd be surprised. People are responsive, and it helps kind of get your cause out there, your issue out there, whatever you're into. And I just think in this age of like flash fiction, which is real short fiction, or Snapchatting and tweeting, I do think the long form model, which is the written word, and you know, 500, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 words, still has an important place as a kind of antidote to that quickness and fastness, and also gives us a space, again, as I mentioned earlier, for sensuality, for slowing down, for really feeling an issue. And you know, back to like the anger, I think it's real easy to get that pop in a tweet, but I think you can much more tastefully and arguably impactfully push an issue or make somebody empathize with your issue in the long form model. And I think blogging is a space that is you can do it yourself. You could guest blog. You can reach out to, sometimes you know, writers will have their own blog and know a little team of blog people that blog, and it's a whole world. I'm not really part of that world, but I do like to dabble in it now and then as a space to just publish, basically. So the last thing I'm going to mention about writing, and in this context blogging, but I think it also works for LTEs, op-eds, and letters to the congressperson, is this actually the classic rhetorical appeals. Because if you can blend these three, and we'll see it with Lois Gibbs's piece in 2016, and we see it in a lot of effective writing. If you can blend these three, and this goes back to Aristotle, this is very old, and the art of rhetoric, which is ultimately what we're dealing with here. It's political, but it's what we're talking about is the art of persuasion, and we're trying to persuade people to think with us, to see things our way, to arguably change, or just to wake up on some level. So we can blend these three classic rhetorical appeals. I think we're in a good space. And this is something to think about if you're getting blocked, or you're trying to think about how to move the middle of your writing or how to end it. I think these three are something you can come back to. So I'll start with logos. This is the classic factual, data-y, science-y, empirical or sense observation. And so this is where you get your numbers, right? And you're writing your LTE, or you're writing your blog post, and you're trying to convince somebody about some issue in your community. And this is where you go out and you gather your facts, you know, and it's wherever you get them from, it's good to cite them. But it's also just effective to have hard numbers. We like facts. They're warm and happy, and well, not always happy, but they seem real, and people like that realness. Scientists show that if temperatures continue rising, right? 3 out of 4 dentists, and just sort of is something you often hear, right? But notice the third one. This is a first person, I would argue, logos-based empirical observation about just seeing bits of plastic on the tide line. Or I remember when Charlie found that meth making dump site, right? Like that is as impactful as it gets. It's showing a logos factual based argument, and people have a real hard time refuting that evidence, right? So this is logos. I think if you can have a little bit of this in your writing soup, it'll add some flavor. Ethos. This is your classic character-based argument. And this is where you might refer to somebody who's thinking, who's just well respected in the world, and perhaps in the environmental world, but just perhaps in politics, or in the just activist world more generally. So this is where you could quote Martin Luther King. I love this quote: "The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Or you could, you know, like I just keep bringing us back to Lois Gibbs, because she's just a classic community grassroots organizer, door-to-door style. And so we could quote her, or of course, Willie Nelson. I just got my Autobahn monthly update, and they quoted Willie Nelson, this quote here. So I borrowed that from Autobahn. Nobody said it was going to be easy. They had some proposals, I think temporarily rejected. They're going to go back to the drawing board. So this is your ethos. This is where you might quote somebody in your LTE, or in your blog post. And it shows just shows respect for others. It also puts you in the company of great thinkers. Any questions on logos or ethos people have sometimes trip up on ethos a little bit, but just want to make sure you get it, or if you have any questions.
I guess we'd started talking about elected officials, and this is getting into the, I guess, accountability, not kind of the emotional aspect. But would you consider quoting an elected official and something that they said about a topic that maybe they're going the other way on? That, how does that fit in, like, with this ethos? Or is it more an expert in the field?
Well, I think that's a really interesting example. And I'm glad you brought it up, because for sure, experts in the field are always good, right? The most respected scientist or classic, whoever that person is. But you'd mentioned the elected official, and I mean, how amazing would it be to like throw a quote in, and then, I mean, especially if they're undermining their own thinking, and call them out on that. I think that'd be an incredibly effective persuasive tool. Um, yeah, that's a great point. We should add that to this slide. Yeah, because ethos is all about character, and it's in a character. I mean, a politician is ultimately a character, right? And they're trying to present themselves as being this type that is likable and going to act on the things that they said they're going to do. So they're all about ethos. They're all about character. And if you can poke holes in that, or you can find paradoxes or contradictions, or you're just like praising them because they're doing exactly what they said they did, you just want them to do a little more or whatever. Like, it's all about what is their character, how are they adhering to that, and how are they perhaps drifting from that. That's exactly what we're talking about. Great example. Any other questions on ethos or logos before we move to the last one, which is maybe the easiest, pathos, arguments based on emotion? Back to the question from earlier, pathos, this is the last one. And so this is where, we often start when we tell our story. It hurts to see plastic on the beach. It hurts to hear about rising temperatures. It hurts to experience these things. And so we come at it from a place of hurt, but also at a place maybe of hope. And I think emotion is what it's all about, but I lead with logos and ethos because I like to start with the emotion. It's like a ball of energy. And we want to carry that energy through the whole piece of writing, the whole blog post. But we also, like we said earlier, want to avoid what I would argue would be like a rant. And we want to temper it with some other great thinkers, right? And some other great facts, the people who have gone out and gathered the information, the Blue Water Task Force, right? That have the numbers, they have the logos, because it just gives us a more well-rounded piece. But at the end of the day, it is an emotional space we're dealing with, certainly in the environmental world. So it pains me to think our grandchildren will inherit this world, or if we don't act now, not only will the wildfires get worse, etc. Not only will I vote for you, but I will be enlightening my community to your nefarious schemes. I should say not vote for you, right? That can scare a politician and get them thinking about what they're doing. And so I just want to end where we started, with Lois Gibbs. And she's still writing. She's still active 40 years later. And so this is an LTE that she wrote out in Pennsylvania, but I think it actually blends all three. And she says, the proposed expansion of Keystone Sanitary Landfill is a perfect example. Nationally, Pennsylvania consistently ranks among leading importers of trash. So there's your logos, right? Locally, Northeast Pennsylvania has 2 mega dumps and plenty of capacity. So why do we need 50 years worth of garbage? It looks to take advantage of the people of Northeast Pennsylvania and keep its lid open as the symbolic trash can of the Northeast. So there's the kind of ethos, right? Blending the people, the character of her community. And then back to in the end here, sometimes the community stands up and fights for what's right. I was part of such a movement, started the Love Canal Homeowners Association in '78. Now, through my role as founder, etc., I'm here to stand up and fight every day. So ending on a nice pathos inspiration. And that's it. That's the end of my slides and my thinking on blogging LTEs and letters to your congressperson. Let me stop the share and we can come back to more of an informal setting. Okay.
Thank you
Paul.
so much, Paul. That was really cool. I love thinking of those 3 topics. And yeah, we can now just open up the floor if people have questions or want to share experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah, you kind of answered my question in the last one, you know, which was what do you lead with? And I guess I would guess that maybe the short answer is what's going to be most impactful, right? That's going to get people's attention and want them to read the next sentence. But it seems like and I think I would agree that pathos is really, if there's a strong pathos statement that you can come up with, that's probably the best option, I would guess.
Yeah, I didn't mention, but also like giving something somebody can visualize, you know, that they can see or smell. I think is really, like, I keep mentioning the senses, but I think it's important as well. So if you can show them the plastic bits on the beach, or you can show them the thing that really impacted you visually or sensually, then I think that they'll, on some level, connect to that.
So the hardwired idea, I guess, huh?
Totally. That's exactly it. It's hardwired.
I had the same question as you, Dennis. I struggle a lot with how to start, how to begin. And I find that I sometimes kind of skip it or put a placeholder and then come back to it. But it's always a struggle for me.
Yeah.
But Paul gave me some great ideas. So thank you for that.
Yeah, just throw a stat in there. If you can't figure it out, it's like, you know, lead with a scary fact or somebody's quote, and just get you going.
I think too, what you said earlier is go back to it over and over again, read it out loud. I mean, I think those techniques always help you to reorganize and come up with something at the beginning.
Yeah. You know what you could also do is, if you know anybody who would argue against you, always good.
Oh.
Because
friendly debate.
Yeah, it's friendly debate.
Jean has her hand up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering how you, Paul, how you initiate being a guest blogger. I mean, it's one thing if I'm going to say, can I guest blog on, you know, Newport Surfrider, but it's another thing to say, you know, how could I guest blog for Sierra Club or for Audubon or for, oh, I don't know, you know, the NRA or something, their newsletter.
You should do that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a website, authors publish, or authors and poets or something. I'll look it up and I can share it with you in a minute. But they have this great database. But I think, like you said, just going to Sierra Club. But I think it's all about the local chapter, right? Because all these big organizations have smaller chapters, and then reaching out to their communications people, because there's usually somebody in communications, and they would like content from people. And so it's just a matter of kind of doing a little bit of legwork of like, okay, this is coastal California Surfrider, North Coast, and then just this area, and here's their website, and here's their communications person. And I think just reaching out to the comms team is always the way to go. At least it's a good way to start. Yeah.
And we've had people approach us, and you know, just as Paul has said, usually it's a partner organization that's asked us for space. I haven't really had sort of like a cold call from an individual for a guest blog, but students we've offered space to, and some have asked for space, but we definitely love receiving content. For example, I think Diane would probably write an extremely interesting blog about diving with the sharks at the aquarium that would suck you in just based on how she speaks about it. And we're happy. Anna will be putting up at our closing sort of a call to action or homework to put your skills in practice. And we're happy to host blogs that are about the ocean if you want to get some practice in.
Thanks.
Yeah, I just put that in the chat too, and you can refine your search there too. So you can do environmental, and there's tons of environmental magazines, and they're pretty up to like current who's actually publishing now. So that's another space you can go as well.
So I have a question about, we usually are thinking about an audience oftentimes when we're writing, but like a letter to the editor, sometimes you're just speaking to your whole community. And so do you have advice on, I guess, connecting when you have such a general audience? Because we talked a lot about our internal motivations and our internal story. But if we're trying to kind of connect with our community members, can you just speak a little on that?
Yeah, the last piece I wrote for the News Times was about the internet going out during teaching. And it was just about the challenge of teaching in the pandemic. And I was just like, okay, people are, staff might read this, community read this, students read this. And the thing I just kept coming back to is just keeping it story form, right? Just like beginning, middle, and end, so that everybody could follow it. And I'm not too worried about the subtext or themes. It's just a good story of this happened. This is where we're at in the pandemic. This is where we're at in the environmental situation, whatever it is. That's where the story is very important to me because it's universal. It's how we think. So that would be my advice. Like, bring it back to story form. Don't, for me, not worrying so much about audience, but being respectful of people's time, Yeah.
But I think Bree raises a good point, though. I mean, there are different perspectives out there, and if you've got a diverse audience, you will catch the attention of probably only some of them for any one of your blogs. And there's something called market segmentation, right? Which who those people are. You've got a general sense of what they care about, who they are,
Yeah.
Who they talk to, who they read. And I'm wondering if there isn't some more targeted advice for those segments. It may require lots of blogs about the same thing or something. I don't really know, but
Yeah.
What do you have any thoughts about those segments of listeners?
I think there's so many perspectives, and it's hard to know who's going to read it. It's hard to know like what the readership's really going to be. But I do suppose at the end of the day, knowing who your publisher is, like where you're publishing, and what that reader might look like, I guess, and I don't know. I just think all readers are kind of people, and they will or won't read it, and if it's written well with good details, good sense details, and a good story, most readers, whoever they are, despite their age, race, or sex, like they're gonna hopefully read your words,
Mhm.
So I guess I don't get too caught up thinking about like readership too much. I try to respect the reader, the capital R, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Something I'll add from our perspective, we're talking about political work and activism. Sometimes it's not necessarily the story itself, it's who's telling the story. So for example, if we need a certain state representative to take action, we're looking, and they own a restaurant, we're looking for restaurant owners in their district to write letters to the editor. So that way it's really sort of connecting with that specific elected official. So this is about us being the storytellers, but sometimes when we're thinking about a campaign or from a more organizational perspective, it's important to think about who the storyteller is. And then just another note on communicating with the elected officials, I think the really personal stories are a great way to connect with them. But another thing is, doing a little research to see if you have commonalities with them. And that Paul had that on his slide. And I shared last week in our training a photo of Senator Roblin with a volunteer dressed up in his Star Wars memorabilia. So that's like something that you can maybe use a Star Wars quote in your letter, or in your letter to the editor, because you know that's going to catch their eye. But also keeping in mind, as Paul said, still stay genuine. So don't make up a love for Star Wars, because he's going to end up finding out you're not really a fan when you start talking about it. But
We'll call you out.
yes.
So that's a really good point about the segmentation issue, because especially in politics, you may want to have a broad story to generate broad support, but there's probably a senator you're trying to influence, so there, I think it's a brilliant idea to sort of go find out who this guy listens to, or this woman listens to, and who feels the same way you do about something, and get them to do a story. I think that's really clever.
That's awesome.
And I'm just checking the clock and want to respect that we said we'd be done by 1.
I have one more. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Well, we still have you on for a few minutes. I'm just wondering if you have kind of a story from your experience of a time that you wrote something and just like a big learning lesson, or just kind of an anecdote from your writing history that might be useful for people.
Yeah. So in 2015 or 16, Greenpeace deployed kayaktivists to block a survey ship from coming into Portland, and they hung from the bridge, and they also were in kayaks blocking, and it was this beautiful, huge activist thing. Well, a year later, I got wind. I was a kayak guide, and I got wind of some training. They were going to do another like kayaktivist training on the Willamette now, and I pitched it to Willamette Week, which is a pretty big publication in Portland. Like, hey, I would like to go hang out and do this thing, right, and write about it, do the training, and all right, go for it, whatever. Well, at that time, 2016 or 17, I don't remember. I'm still super new to it, but I was new at that point, and I just like really went like kind of all in on the poetic, like too literary, I guess, right? Like describing like biceps and things. And the editor's like his edits were so slice and dice that the point being like, you kind of want to, I learned to temper my emotion. I'll talk about tempering that pathos, right? And like and he was really adamant about like, what was their message? What was their political message? So I think as writers, some of us tend to want to dip our toe into that poetic, romantic, Barry Lopez, or like, kind of that world, which is beautiful. But when we're doing more politically focused LTEs, or like blogs that have a purpose, I think it's good to maybe tone that down. So that would be my story of learning, like tone it down a little bit, curb your enthusiasm, and get the point across.
Great, thank you. That was a great story with a great lesson.
Yeah.
So we want to end with sharing our, I think my computer is having a weird moment. I wanted to end with sharing our call to action. So let me just see if I can pull it up. There we go. Sorry, technical difficulties. So yeah, we've got these great lessons from Paul, but we also want to empower you to take some time to write. So tell your story, and it could be, a moment from Saturday afternoon when you were walking on the beach, or about your lifelong stewardship of the ocean. Whatever it is, it's something that is meaningful to you, and something that you want to share with others. And then think about how you want to share that story, whether it's a quick post on social media, or a letter to an editor, or a longer blog post if you want to try to be a guest blog. I love that idea. Or send a post to us at Surfrider, and we can post it either with your name or anonymously if that's preferred. But yeah, that's our action request. We won't set a deadline, but
Yeah, and feel free to reach out to us if you have questions. Thank you so much, Paul, for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That was great.
yeah.
Thank you, Paul.
You're welcome. Thanks, Dad.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Great training. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank
Thanks,
you
Dad.
all for joining.
Thank you, Paul.
You're welcome.
And thank you for Anna and Bree for putting it together.
Absolutely. Well, we get to learn a lot too. So
Yeah.
and hopefully you can all join us on Thursday to talk, continue the storytelling theme with visual storytelling and photography.
On my calendar.
All
So-
right. We'll
Thanks
see
so
you
much.
Thursday then. All
Bye,
right.
everyone.
Enjoy the
Bye.
rest of the day.